Throughout the history of the U.S., there have been movements such as the African American Civil Rights, Feminist, and anti-war movements that have changed the course of history. The government and leaders helped with the success as well as the failures of these movements. Of course, as time has showed though, these movements' success outweighed the obstacles they came across, and to give more people the right to the pursuit of happiness our fathers originally wanted. The government and various leaders of the American civil rights movements performed several actions that helped the movement succeed, while other activities they did caused the movement to fail in certain areas. Some of the actions, like the sit-ins at all-white restaurants, helped several civil rights groups like the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, succeed in their movement's goal. However, while there were successes, there were also failures such as the setbacks in equality due to civil rights groups like the Nation of Islam. Even the government had a variety of results when they made executive decisions like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and attempted to enforce the laws. Each event that happened within the African American civil rights groups had both successes and failures that accompanied their movement's actions. One of the main contributors to the African American movements are the leaders of the organizations. The African American movement had great leaders that helped pave the way for others in their groups as well. Leaders like Martin Luther King showed their members that there are ways that they can reach their goals without using violence to achieve it. Martin Luther King is known to be one of the best leaders of the African American movement due to his dedication, his peaceful advancements, and his inability to back down or fight back. Martin Luther King planned out events that got violent on the opposing side, like the March on Selma. Even the college students became leaders when they began to assist in the movements and got the African Americans to participate in the same nonviolent activities organized by the college students. He even went to jail due to the nonviolent campaigning and wrote a letter to the ministers of a church rather than starting a riot in the jailhouse. However, despite the many beneficial leaders of the African American civil rights movement, there were leaders such as Malcolm X who preached black supremacy and advocated violence to get equality. Leaders like Malcolm X were never really around for long, mainly because Malcolm X was killed by the Nation of Islam, who didn't believe in what he was preaching. He, however, was able to collect a mass amount of new followers. As a violent African American group, they got a lot of attention. And as an advocator of violence, he also collected those who believed that collected nonviolent protesting wasn't going to be able to get them the rights they needed. There were copious amounts of leaders who taught violence, like Malcolm X, to succeed, and there were even more who taught nonviolence, such as Congress of Racial Equality and Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Whether or not a group was nonviolent wasn't based on what the leader said, but it was mostly based on the various groups that arose to strike the Deep South for racial equality or another type of goal, which either benefited or failed the movement. During the African American movement, there were endless lists of groups that helped benefit the movement as a whole and caused the movement to succeed. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the succeeding groups, organized several events that helped shake the segregation laws by performing things like sit-ins which kept places from getting business and eventually forced integration. Other succeeding groups like Congress of Racial Equality and Southern Christian Leadership Conference performed marches and gave frequent speeches to teach their members what needed to happen in order to achieve their goal without it getting out of control. However, there are other more violent groups with goals that were nearly opposite of the ones that the nonviolent groups put together. The Nation of Islam, led by Malcolm X, was a very prominent group that advocated supremacy over integration and was not afraid to use violence to show that African Americans had power to take control of the situation. A faction of the civil rights movement jump-started the Black Power movement, where African Americans actually began to fight to remain separate yet equal. Groups like the Nation of Islam failed to help the African American civil rights movement succeed in certain areas. Various groups of civil rights activists participated and either failed or benefited the movement as a whole. Groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, SNCC, use a specific type of protest to accomplish their goal and get businesses to integrate. This protest is called a sit-in. The sit-ins were used against restaurants and colleges, all of which had different types of successes and failures. The SNCC took a page from the labor workers in the past who sat inside of the businesses so no one could enter to take their jobs. During these sit-ins, African Americans would go into the restaurants and sit at the all-white counters so that no one could order, and they did this over a course of a few days. Eventually, the sit-ins would partially work and the business would allow African Americans to eat at the same place the whites could, while others would rather close their business down than allow the African Americans to eat in their restaurant. These sit-ins were meant to be nonviolent, so those who participated were not allowed to fight back when they were attacked by the whites. Sit-ins often turned violent due to the lack of food and the irritations of other customers. The members of the protests got violently hurt and yanked out of their seats so people would act. A lot of the time, the sit-ins accomplished their goals of forcing businesses to integrate. Other times, it got too violent and the sit-in had to be aborted, giving this protest a varying failing and succession. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, planned and participated in the Freedom Riders movement. After law was passed to integrate interstate travel, the Freedom Riders' goal was to ensure that the South was following the same laws that the North did. The Freedom Riders had several successes accompanied by one major failure. When the Freedom Riders tested out the bus travel, they went down to the Deep South where the Southerners didn't like the fact that the travel on buses was permitted to be integrated, and so they took matters in their own hands. On the way to Jackson, Mississippi, the Freedom Riders got jumped by 200 angry white civilians. The failures of the Freedom Riders are that the bus was stoned and the tires were slashed. When the truck went away to go change a tire, the bus got firebombed, and despite the Freedom Riders not fighting back or doing any harm, they still had to go to jail. Even though the Freedom Riders suffered through massive amounts of violent treatment, the movement caused the government to pay attention to what was happening down south. After the Freedom Riders received copious amounts of attention, many people began to join into the movement, and not just the African Americans. Whites and blacks all participated in the event. The failures that happened to the Freedom Riders actually helped turn the event into a success as a whole. A major component to the movement was the Heart of Atlanta Supreme Court case. This court case helped the movement by showing the African Americans that the government was also on the side of equality and was trying to help everyone become equal. A hotel, called the Heart of Atlanta, tried to ensure that no colored people were going to be able to stay inside of their hotel. However, when the ordeal was taken to court, the Supreme Court decided that the hotel was ruining the Interstate Commerce Act, and in favor of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court decided that it was wrong to deny African Americans the right to stay there. This event was a pure win for the African American civil rights movement. Much like any movement, there were several U.S. government failures that did not help the African American movement. When the governor of Mississippi did not prevent the angry citizens from attacking the Freedom Riders on their way down to the South, the official government didn't do much until after the riders have already got down there, nearly beat to death, and placed in jail. Even the law enforcement became a problem. When the Freedom Riders were nearing the first phase of the buses, the law enforcement stood watching as the angry white community tore the bus apart and even stood still while the people blew up the bus. No one was arrested. The police were informed of the attack by the FBI before it even happened. Yet, the police did nothing to stop the attack from happening and stayed away for a certain amount of time. These types of events weren't the only ones that government had a failure in. After the Supreme Court case, Brown 2, the government proclaimed that all schools had to integrate, but the schools decided upon themselves when exactly they would integrate their school. The event caused the U.S. government to fail the African American civil rights movement in its lack of proper enforcement. There were also several government successes in the African American civil rights movement. Although the death of John F. Kennedy is considered a tragedy for the United States, it benefited the movement. When Lyndon B. Johnson was placed into presidency, he pushed the Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, which helped secure rights for all African Americans and the other minorities. During the heart of Atlanta, the United States government passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination on public and private property for public accommodation, such as hotels. Civil Rights Act of 1964 wasn't just about public accommodations. It was also about preventing discrimination in the workplace that would stop someone of another race or sex from getting a job. Some of the actions of the government actually did benefit the African American civil rights movement, helping them to succeed by giving them constitutional rights and with the Supreme Court ruling in their favor a few times. Due to the various participation of the government, influential leaders, and other events that have been the fails and successes of the movement were attributed to these things. The government brought a few failures, like the failure to enforce laws like they should have when the Freedom Riders were attacked. However, the government also had a few successful tendencies when they helped protect the Freedom Riders, and the government ruled in their favor of the African Americans during the Heart of Atlanta trial. Even the leaders of the movements contributed to how the movement progressed, whether it was a violent or nonviolent approach, like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The events that happened also helped the movement succeed and fail in certain areas, like the sit-ins of restaurants and the Black Power movement. One non-violently protested while the other advocated fighting and supremacy. These varieties of events all contributed to the successes and failures of the African American civil rights movement. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, many civil rights movements were gaining attention. Leaders and the U.S. government helped create both success and failures for the feminist movement. Both the president and activists helped change how women were perceived by others. The second wave of feminism had a way more profound impact on American culture than that of the first wave. In the early 60s, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which empowered women to overcome stereotypes placed upon them during the 1950s. Friedan continued to empower women with the Women's Statement of Purpose, where she declared that women need to refute the assumption that a woman is automatically entitled to lifelong support by a man upon her marriage. This rallied women to fight back against people who believe there should only be half equality for women. John F. Kennedy created the President's Commission on the Status of Women to combat sexual harassment in the workplace. This organization sought out to end discrimination in the workplace and resulted in the creation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination by covered employers on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In an attempt to obtain more rights for women, the National Organization for Women was formed. This group attended JFK's Commission on the Status of Women and released feminist literature like Friedan's Woman's Statement of Purpose. Now fought for women's education, wages, and presence in politics. The feminist movement saw many successes, but Sandra Day O'Connor's appointment to the Supreme Court in 1984 was very pivotal for feminists. But the feminist movement's biggest success was Roe v. Wade in 1973, where the Supreme Court ruled that women have the right to abortions in any and all states. The feminist movement was pretty successful, but it did suffer from its fair share of problems not caused by the government. The response of conservative women hurt the perception of feminists. The failure of the Equal Rights Amendment saw another win for conservatism over feminism. 38 votes were needed to pass it, and conservatives caused it to fail by making only 35 states vote. Another idea that hurt the feminist movement was the idea of reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination is the idea that if women are given better chances at getting a job than men, then men are being discriminated. This caused feminists to be seen as discriminatory and uncivil, which was the total opposite of what feminists wanted. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, many civil rights movements were gaining attention. Leaders and the U.S. government helped create both success and failures for the feminist movement. Both the president and activists helped change how women were perceived by others. In the 1960s through the 1980s, the feminist movement was at a high point. Women wanted to be viewed as equals to men socially, economically, and politically. The government had involvement in this certain movement that led to successes as well as failures. Their lack of proper enforcement of the newly created laws showed that even after the government is on the side of the women, they still had obstacles to overcome. The leaders of the feminist movement were a big influence that impacted the outcome of the movement, which is easily evident to be successful. Politically, the feminist leaders wanted to get more attention. They wanted higher roles in the political field. This movement has been so successful that it almost led to the first ever United States female president in 2008. In the first half of the 20th century, there were women in offices like the House of Representatives and Senate. However, a huge success for the feminist movement was when Ronald Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor as the first ever Justice of the Supreme Court in 1981. Many organizations helped bring about these changes, such as NOW, National Organization for Women. These organizations did protests to raise awareness. They picketed signs and did parades to get their point across that women deserve and have the right to equality. Roe v. Wade was a controversial decision by the Supreme Court to legalize abortion in all states. This also had an accompanying case known as Doe v. Bolton. Both of these cases were in 1973 and landmarked the fact that women had the right to do whatever they wanted with their body. Though Roe's intention wasn't to legalize abortion, she was known as a great advocate in the movement, but later mentioned that she had made a mistake and wishes the court overturns their decision. Economically, women at the time were being paid less, which is an injustice that the feminists would soon change. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1965 helped fix this issue and was known as a great success and milestone in the movement. However, though this was a success to fix the economic injustice at the time, the government did not do enough to make sure the businesses were enforcing it enough. The law was eventually enforced properly. At the start, women had a hard time finding jobs since the men were slow to hire them due to the fear of the women getting pregnant and taking money, as well as time, away from the business during their absence. Women also could apply for any job that they were suited for with the proper education thanks to the Equal Opportunity Education Act of 1975. This led to many more women in paid workplaces and away from house jobs, such as cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the kids at home, which broke the customs of the 1950s norm. This also led women to be able to be independent and not rely on a man to be the so-called breadwinner. Women were buying houses and living in them without needing financial support. This proved to be great successes for women in the movement. Finally, the most important factor that women strived for in the feminist movement was a change to the social customs of the previous decade. Leaders such as Betty Friedan helped women, especially those of middle class, to stand up to the idea that they need to be in the kitchen. Many televised shows at the time portrayed women as the caretakers in the household with all the chores. In 1969, a feminist and activist named Gloria Steinem, influential leader towards rights women had to an abortion and other views, published an article, After Black Power Women's Liberation. Betty Friedan writes the woman's statement of purpose to make women think, as well as men, on a different form of a marital relation where the husband and wife are equal in the household and share the work in paying economic burdens. Friedan also wrote The Feminine Mystique, which is widely known to a lot of historians as the spark that started the second wave of the feminist movement. She wrote the book in 1963 to say that housewives were unhappy and how hard their lives were. It also tells women they don't have to live by this tradition, and if breaking it makes them happy, then they should have the right to, even if it makes society view them differently. JFK also tried to help by lowering sexual harassment in the workplace and strongly enforcing against domestic violence. This success in government towards the movement gave many women hope to know that they were getting backed up. This escalated the number of members, which was another win for the feminists. Evidently, this area of the movement was one of the most successful, considering that now women freely live alone, are breadwinners, and choose to get married or not without the pressure of a closed-minded society. It's true that this movement was an overall success, with minor failures that prevented it from being fully successful. The feminist movement has been challenged by conservatives and the new right at the time. This did not fully stop their progression. Thanks to the help of presidents like JFK and Reagan, for example, the feminists had great success in influencing the making of laws to solidify their rights as equals to men politically, socially, and economically.